which is essentially a panel discussion focusing on geoeconomics of the Indo-US business, with renowned panelists, namely Mr. Shivendra Singh, who's Vice President of Global Trade NASSCOM, and Mr. Shankar Iyer, an eminent journalist as well as an author. The book summary that will be presented today is a book written by Ruchir Sharma called The 10 Rules of Successful Nations. Today, we look forward to hear these experts share their views on the future of Indo-US business, given the political environment in both the countries currently. But before that, I'd like to formally introduce Advait's organization called Upohan Management Consultants to you all. So Upohan is a boutique strategy and HR consulting company based in Pune, working with small and large clients in Pune, other cities as well, over a decade, and touching upon different industry verticals like manufacturing, consumer goods, retail, IT, etc. And Advait Kurlekar, its CEO, is a career management consultant with over 27 years of consulting experience and has worked for the likes of A. Ferguson, KPMG, PwC, etc. He's worked with clients in India as well as UK, Europe, Africa, and across the world. And Advait is a Wharton alumni and has been teaching business strategy in Dubai, Singapore, Sydney, business schools, etc. He's also a Thai Pune charter member and has been mentoring startups for many years. He's also an independent director in a couple of companies and on the board of advisors of several business schools. That's about Advait. Now let me introduce Eklavya's profile to you. So Eklavya Malhotra, who is with Upohan since its inception, has handled n number of consulting assignments across service verticals for clients in India and abroad. He's an avid reader and has been spearheading Upohan's Between the Lines series, which we're going to witness today, for the last over 3 years. He is a retail management professional. Before starting to work with Upohan, he has worked in the Future Group as well. So with this backdrop, I would hand over to Advait to take the event ahead. Advait.
Advait, you'll have to.
You're on mute.
Advait, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Rajita, and thanks Indo-American Chamber of Commerce partnering with us for this Between Line session, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. Just to give a quick background, last 3 years we've been organizing this program called Between the Lines. It's a monthly program that we organize. Every month we pick up a management book that we believe is a good book to read or has been recently launched, like today's book. And since every book has great insights and learnings, depending on what those insights are and what the topics are, we invite veterans and industry people from people from the industry, and I moderate a panel discussion on the topic. So the discussion is never on the book, but on the book is just the context setting, and the discussion will be on the topic in.
Advait, are you there? Okay, I think Advait's got a poor connection right now. There is some unseasonal rain happening in Pune. Okay, Advait, you either go on or give up.
No, you continue with that.
Okay, so Advait, unlike Trump, has decided to concede, and I shall take over the role of the moderator-elect. Okay, I think we'll begin. Just to fill in the gaps in terms of what Advait was trying really hard to put forth. The tone of the session is going to be that I'll be presenting a summary of the book that we have chosen for today. That's Ruchir Sharma's book, 10 Rules of Successful Nations. And that book is essentially going to lay down the context within which we shall have the subsequent panel discussion featuring Shankar and Shivendra. So that's basically the agenda. And during the course of the panel discussion, we would request all the audience members to feel free to put forth any questions that they might have of either Shankar or Shivendra. They can put it in the chat box. I believe that would be active. And we'll try and take up as many of those as we can possibly during the course of the next an hour or so. So that's it. And with that, let's begin. I'll just share my screen and take you through a small presentation that we've prepared, and we'll take it forward from there. Yeah. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes, you may want to do a slideshow, but it's not full screen.
Oh, it's not in slideshow, is it? Okay, yeah. Let me just do that once again. Rujuta, is it better now?
Yes, now it is.
All right, and just to ensure that there's no bandwidth issues for me, I'll switch off my video for the time being. And yeah, with that, let's get started. And it's always good to start with some good news, because God knows that we need some good news right now. And after a few days of suspense and surprises, Joe Biden was declared the president-elect. But if you thought that this will signal an end to all the drama, did you forget that it is 2020 and this year is not going to go down without a fight? So this was supposed to be a generation-defining election, but it has more or less turned out to be a defiling election of sorts. And did anybody really think that the squatter-in-chief is going to vacate his rent-free accommodation so easily? Frankly, you can't even quite blame him, because it's a pretty sweet deal for somebody who is morally and financially bankrupt. Maybe Joe Biden will be well advised to reach out to certain Indian political leaders to learn how a government can forcefully evict tenants. So while we should actually be right now witnessing a presidential transition taking place, which will hopefully put up a better and stronger fight to the pandemic, what we're actually witnessing is an illegal, ludicrous, and laughably incompetent presidential coup which is taking place in the world's oldest democracy. It's frankly quite exhausting now to keep track of the ridiculous lawsuits, the outlandish conspiracy theories, and flagrant attempts to overturn the election. So let's turn our attention to something that is a bit less infuriating. The world's largest and the world's oldest democracies have had many ups and downs in their relationship, but despite all third country interruptions, the US-India economic relationship has been stable to some extent. Indo-US trade relations are exceptional, in which the US obviously has become India's largest trading partner now, while India's share in US trade is surprisingly very small. The topic for today's discussion is not just important, in light of the election results, but it also assumes significance on account of other related developments that have been taking place in the last few weeks and months. So, for instance, the Indo-US 2+2 dialogue, the signing of the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, strengthening of the Quad, and I'm sure much to the delight of our audience, which has joined us today, the increased progress on the China +1 business strategy. So all of these things have been coming together quite fortuitously in the last few weeks and months. And it pretty much sets the context of why this discussion could not have come at a more opportune time. So the world is in a flux, it's in a state of flux, and investors are obviously on the hunt, as they always are. Some countries are likely to rise while others will lag and fall behind. And as the COVID-19 pandemic rages on, politicians, business leaders, economists, investors, they are all trying to make sense of what the future holds. And Ruchir Sharma, in this adaptation of his 2016 bestseller book, The Rise and Fall of Nations, the global investor and author that he is, he's basically used his unique set of rules to identify which nations are likely to emerge winners in a post-pandemic world. Whenever that world comes your guess is as good as mine. So in case anybody does not know, Ruchir is the chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley, and he shot to fame with his very first book, Breakout Nations, which was published in 2012. And this most recent book of his, which published earlier this year, 10 Rules of Successful Nations, this is targeted at entrepreneurs, technocrats, corporate leaders, and investors. And I think we have a good mix of all of these people on the group today. And it provides a framework of rules that can help predict which countries will rise and those whose prospects are diminishing, to say the least. He has based the book on data gathered over the last couple of decades. And now, in fact, in the last couple of months, he has further distilled his 10 rules to top 4 rules, which he believes will matter the most. These include a competent government, low debt, domestic strength, and technology sophistication. Based on these these top 4 rules of his, Ruchir has put together a list of winners that will thrive in the post-pandemic world. And just to give you all a spoiler alert, the top 5 does not include the US or China. And like he has been famously trying to coin this phrase over the last so many years now, he continues to say that India continues to disappoint the optimists and the pessimists alike. So we seem to be an equal opportunity offender. And as always, we are middling our way with a few hits and misses on these parameters. And according to his ranking, India is 13 out of 25 in this list of nations that are likely to stand tall in the post-COVID world. And just in case you're curious, which are the 5 nations that he's backing to emerge as winners in the next 2 or 3 years, that list includes Germany, Finland, Switzerland, Taiwan, and probably his perennial favorite, Vietnam. So Ruchir points out that all of his research and deep analysis, and mind you, there is a lot of deep analysis in the book, it has highlighted a fascinating pattern of a very strong decadal trend in the post-Second World War landscape. So this decadal trend, what I mean is that the trends are often defined by a decade. And even though the end of a decade should not really warrant any change in the trend, just because the calendar changes, why should the trend change, follow suit? But this is, it's actually quite remarkable how often that does transpire. So in the last decade, you had the 2008 global financial crisis, which marked a huge shift. The decade before that, you had the tech boom, the dot-com boom and bust cycle, which happened right at the turn of that decade when the millennium changed. The decade before that, again, in Japan, you had the Japanese bubble, which finally burst and has never come back post that. And now we have coronavirus making its presence felt at the turn of this decade. So while these 4 rules of a strong domestic market, a competent government, fiscal debt, and digital sophistication might be viewed as showstoppers over, say, an 18 to 24-month horizon, all of the 10 rules put together, which he has stitched in the book, are perennial factors that will go a long way in determining if and when a nation is likely to succeed. So the first rule is that the population plays an integral part in the economic growth of a country. And any country that has a negative population growth rate will lead to a slowdown in the economy, specifically the working population, which comprises the age group between 18 to 60 years and contributes massively to any nation's economy. Giant economies like US have obviously been built on the back of immigrants, and that's why it's somewhat ironic that it's turning its back on the same working class immigrant population now. Ruchir also mentions Russia as an example where the participation of women in the workforce has been actively encouraged. And many other countries, like he mentioned, Singapore, Canada, Australia, France, have actually promoted childbirth actively. Even China has abandoned its one-child policy in 2015. However, the impact of state-encouraged measures to increase population is relatively slow and unpredictable due to cultural and political reasons. The population rise doesn't always translate into economic growth because political will and the right reform measures are also essential along with these. So when the population growth is negative, then it is bound to show negative growth at the point where it fails to provide the replacement people that are required in the workforce. So actually this means bad news for nearly all of the developed economies. And at the same time, it's good news because the population rise in Singapore and Australia are likely to provide a thrust to their respective economies. So it's a win some, lose some kind of scenario at the global stage right now. And US and Canada in particular, he mentions that they will have to maintain an influx of minimum 3% of the immigrant workforce every year to support their economic agenda. And Germany also will have to allow 1.5 million immigrants every year until 2030, just to keep up. So keeping the ratio of the dependent population low is also another measure to fuel economic growth and to determine whether a nation will be successful or not. And that's probably the reason why including the women workforce, increasing the retirement age, all of this adds to the output of the economy and the number of workers as well. So now we have countries like Germany, Italy, Portugal, just to name a few, which have increased the retirement age to 67 and are now thinking of increasing it to 70, which is actually corresponding to the average life expectancy age in these countries. Moving on to the second rule of politics. So there's a very profound statement that Ruchir has written in the book that a crisis forces a nation to reform. The reform leads to good times, and the good times then in turn give birth to an arrogance which leads to a new crisis. And that is pretty much the circle of life in politics. The book narrates multiple examples where the political leader first comes in as a reformer, conducts the reforms, benefits society, but later arrogance gets the better of him, and his focus remains solely on how to retain his power. He gives the example of Putin in Russia, Suharto in Indonesia, Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, and Erdogan in Turkey. All of these are obviously shining examples of this phenomenon. Xi Jinping also has pretty much secured his political seat till the cows come home. The only exception which he mentions was Lee Kuan Yew, pictured over here, who governed Singapore famously for 3 decades and never really ran out of steam. Ruchir goes on to mention that the head of the state should be a man of the masses and not a technocrat, because a man of the masses can probably forge a better link or a rapport with people for the reforms that are necessary to be carried out, while the reforms done by a technocrat will not really be visible as there is probably a communication gap between him and the people. In this regard, he states the example of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was not really a politician or a man of the masses. And that's why maybe his reforms were not so visible and transparent to the common man. So progress has to be in line with the people's sentiments, or else it can backfire, as in the case of Argentina, where all efforts to stabilize the peso pretty much messed up the entire economy. Moving on to the third rule, Ruchir postulates that there are 2 types of billionaires, good and bad billionaires. And mind you, this book came out before the Netflix show came out. So kudos to him for coining the term. He says that industries like manufacturing, infrastructure, services, technology, these industries tend to churn out good billionaires, whereas in contrast, industries like commodities, mining, oil and gas, real estate, throw out the rotten ones. So naturally, when a high percentage of a nation's wealth is in the hands of billionaires, there's a good possibility of civil unrest, as has been evidenced in the case of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Compared to the total billionaires' wealth in good economies, the percentage of bad billionaires' wealth is relatively so relatively less. The US has 14% bad billionaires' wealth compared to 67% in Russia. Yet another parameter which he brings about is self-made billionaires, which would actually indicate whether the economy is growing or not. At a very fundamental level, bad billionaires are constantly on the lookout to shifting the balance of wealth in the society, whereas good billionaires are hopefully working towards increasing the pie and paying it forward. So how big should a government be in a country? Probably big enough to sustain a crisis and small enough to carry out the basic governance tasks. The government should be able to generate revenue out of taxes and activities and then do the necessary spending on necessary public conveniences, infrastructure, facilities. This obviously means rigorous tax enforcements, which may not always yield the desired results. And he gives the example of Indonesia in that context. He also gives the example of China, which was able to relinquish control over some of its state-run businesses and allowed them to expand and flourish. He has also analyzed that economies with less state-owned banks perform way better as the state cannot use the money for their own narrow political benefits. Anyhow, this topic of governance and state interference is probably too close to our panelist Shankar's heart, and he's one of the leading voices on this topic. So I'll just say that if you want to delve deeper into this pet peeve, do yourself a favor and pick up a copy of his latest bestseller, The Gated Republic. Ruchir stresses the point that successful economies have made the best use of their geographical location. Yet again, the example is China, which has built deep seaports in the fishing villages and has the top 6 of the world's 10 busiest harbors. So prosperous countries tend to have good ties with the neighbors to promote each other's trade. And case in point being Europe and Southeast Asian countries, where they have the least number of trade embargoes. But South Asian countries, so more of our territory, our part of the world, have not been able to resolve these frictions and take significant advantage of any neighborly love. Countries also look for, the opportunities to grab businesses like what Vietnam does tremendously well, and Taiwan also. And he also mentions that there is a pressing need to decentralize and develop additional second cities. Decentralization will also help reduce the citizens' frustration that development and jobs are only taking place in a few metros. And it also provides the much needed space for widespread trade in the region and in the country itself. Again, stating China's example, Ruchir writes that I think some 19 cities have been developed over there, the second cities which he mentions, whereas in India, he only includes 2 cities in his list, Malappuram and Kollam, if I'm not mistaken. And he also goes on to say that, yeah, in where credit is due, India has tried creating the special economic zones to promote trade, but unfortunately, bureaucracy has rendered them pretty much ineffective to a great extent. Now, all of us have learned that GDP is the sum total of spending by consumers and government, plus investment and net exports. So the critical thing over here is the investment by the government and the private sector. The investment parameter shows how much the government and private bodies are investing in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in services, all of it hopefully with the endeavor to generate jobs. Government spending ideally should be between 25 to 35% of the GDP. And his research indicates that in the weaker economies, this value is hovering somewhere around the 20% mark. It also matters, in fact, where the money is being invested, because good investment will go into roads, bridges, railways, ports, technology, manufacturing, all of those areas, whereas the bad investment will go into real estate, it will go into commodities, which may lead to problems in the long term. So any asset which leads to a less increase in productivity will not be beneficial in the long term. And he further emphasizes that investment in technology sector is imperative right now. And he says that acquisition of any kind in the technology sector will reap benefits sometime or the other. So you can be rest assured about that. One of the examples that he mentions is the setting up of the optical fiber network in the United States during the dot-com boom time. It remained idle for quite some time. The cables were not in use, but later on, obviously the US started getting the advantage of high-speed internet much before the rest of the world did. Similarly, China's investment in robotics, Israel's investment in robotics is also reaping benefits in all walks of life, whether it is personal use or in the manufacturing sector as well. So when it comes to inflation, Ruchir mentions that there is probably no other parameter that impacts everybody in the economy more than inflation does. It affects the citizens' day-to-day living, and it worries the economists and the pundits for the macro level parameters on which the country's development hinges upon. And quite honestly, there are a few ways to control inflation, which he mentioned and talks at length in the book, but obviously none of them is ever perfect. He's of the opinion that countries and central banks have to strive to achieve that magic mark of 2% inflation, which is the right fit in a growing economy. So if you look at this visual, in terms of currency, what he's talking about here is that successful nations feel cheap. Now, feel is the key word over here. How does one feel when one travels to another country? Do you feel that things are cheap there? So can you spend on items, tourism, and travels without any remorse? Then this particular economy or country is probably booming. And he does give a few examples which we can correlate with, like the Starbucks index. And of course, mind you, ceteris paribus applies over here also. But let's not get overly swayed by this feel aspect, because, frankly, if something feels cheap, if a country feels cheap and still the money is not coming into the economy, then something is amiss. This means that the currency will depreciate further, or the policies in the country are not good enough. Whereas if the money is coming into the country through other means like remittances from people working abroad, interest payments or investments, then that bodes well for the economy's growth. Debt, it can be an economic booster when it is used in the right manner, whereas it can wreak havoc on the economy if it is used in the wrong way. The US is obviously caught in a somewhat of a debt trap right now. That is a condition where too much debt weakens the growth, which obviously elicits a policy response from the Fed that creates more debt, that results in even more disappointing business conditions. So Ruchir goes on to talk about how a society or a country at large can have a debt mania, or it can have a debt phobia. When it is on debt mania mode, the people or the industry will take debt for the growth. And, in case the rate of economic growth is greater than the rate of increase in debt, it's all good. But if it is the reverse, then the financial system is in for a big problem, because someday you'll have to pay the interest. So he talks about China yet again being a loan maniac. They bought pretty much everything on loan. And even after the global financial crisis in the last decade, for the next 10 years also subsequently, $80 trillion of debt was consumed worldwide, out of which $35 trillion found its way into China. So China's share of the global debt was significantly high even then. They were buying factories, houses, even stocks on loan. And there was such a mass hysteria in China that we can achieve any growth rate. And, it was more or less considered to be patriotic to be participating in the China growth story by taking upon more debt. But not surprisingly, it was not sustainable. And that growth was really something which was dubious to a great extent. Real estate prices also fell. Companies could not perform to the expected levels on which the stocks were selling. And yeah, China had to take back on a lot of its promises. Lastly, Ruchi states that one should not follow the media hype too seriously. The countries that were once hyped up and earmarked for hypergrowth have fallen flat due to various reasons. And at the same time, countries that were looked upon as being inflicted with poverty and corruption have slowly risen up to be the world's economic powerhouses. So he says that there is a sort of a curse, interestingly. He mentions that there is a curse that the one who is hyped and comes on the cover story of the Time magazine will actually have a high probability of failing to meet the expectations. More than 55% of the promoted stories on time cover have fallen way below normal expectations. So wise and advised national leaders will try not to let the hype go to their heads, and they will keep pushing reforms even when the economy is roaring and soaring and the world is applauding. So, these are the 10 salient rules that are available to us, courtesy Ruchir Sharma, for us to understand and assess where exactly the economy is heading. But it will rarely happen that all the 10 rules will fit the bill on a single economy at the same time. So that brings us to the moot point for today's session. My name is Eklavya Malhotra, and over to Advait for the main feature of today's session.
Thanks, Eklavya. I hope that my issues have got sorted out, and $1 billion question is where you've left behind us to discuss what's the future for Indo-US business relations. So thanks for the discussion. It gives me pleasure to take on to the next part, is formally introducing our panelists today, starting with Shankar Iyer. I think Eklavya mentioned. Shankar is a celebrated award-winning author, journalist, columnist, faculty member. He's been in this space for more than 3 decades. Currently, and thanks Shankar for getting up early and joining us from Toronto. That's I don't know, pretty early for you there, but thanks for doing that. And right now, I'm sure he's on his 4th book, if I'm not mistaken. Eklavya did mention about his most recent one, which is The Gated Republic, and we had actually used that book as a context setting for one of our earlier programs on the new education policy a couple of months back. Shankar is a visiting senior fellow at IDFC Institute, and he's a fellow from Cambridge University, and like I said, worked in the media for long, including media in Pune, where me and Eklavya hail from. And thanks, Shankar, again for taking this time out to be part of this discussion.
It's a pleasure.
Moving on, we have Shivendra Singh, who's the Vice President and Head of Global Trade Development at NASSCOM, which is of course, the IT industry's body, which is now, of course, globally famous. He has been in policy advocacy, market development, communication, outreach, these kind of fields for quite some time now. His main job is obviously to interact with think tanks, analysts, embassies, diplomats, to sort of take the cause of NASSCOM and IT industry at different various forums. And he's a regular speaker at CNBC and NASSCOM and ET. And if any of you would have researched him, there are several videos of him in terms of television interviews and things like that. So Shivendra, I know you've been busy. We've been trying to sort of, communicate with you for over. I mean, one thought that one is busy, but after looking at Shivendra's schedule, suddenly I thought I'm a total Lukha kind of person. So thanks, Shivendra, for taking time out on a late evening, Friday evening, and joining this session.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So let me start with the last slide that Eklavya had. And since, the reason why we chose this topic this month is obviously, we knew that today was 20th and 3rd November, we thought that by 4th November, things would be clear. I'm not sure things are clear, but let's address the elephant in the room, as they say. And maybe I'll start with Shivendra, you first. Is that we're talking of elephant in the room. So is it the elephant or is it the donkey that we should think of? And more importantly, forget the politics part of it, what implications it has in terms of the Indo-US relations in general and Indo-US business in particular.
Thank you so much, Advait, and thanks for your kind words. And thank you, IACC, for inviting me for this session, and glad to meet you, Shankar, as well. Well, politics is something which is very, very predictable at one side, unpredictable on the other side. So I'm not a politician, so I wouldn't focus on the politics at hand. I would much rather focus on the policies.
Sure.
And, if I look at the perspective from our side, we have congratulated President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, our Prime Minister has congratulated him. So, that is something which we've done. We've seen that, there hasn't been a formal acknowledgement from President Trump on that, but, we'll see how that pans out. Sure. I think, typically, I would see this as, something which is, from a geopolitical perspective, as the government has highlighted, the relationship between India and US has been very, very good in the recent past. You talked about the 2+2. We talked about the commercial and strategic dialogue. I was just part of the ICT joint working dialogue, which also happened relatively recently. So, the whole idea is there are various formal mechanisms that we have seen which have helped move this relationship forward. The growth of bilateral trade has increased by about 400% since 2005 to nearly $150 billion. The technology sector, is critical to this growth of, bilateral trade. Yeah, is performing an even more, critical role in the current pandemic, and I'm so proud to be a part of this sector. Whether it's maintaining the critical healthcare infrastructure, including hospitals, or online education, or the fact that we are doing what we are doing today. Working on molecules for the development of the vaccine. All of that, has really transformed, and the industry has pivoted very well on that. You look at some of the other sectors, banking, financial services industry, contactless mobile payments, and all of that, again, is a, and healthcare, wearable devices, medical devices, all of that is pretty much, highlighting the role of the tech sector, which, if you looked at the first and the second quarter results of the large companies, yeah, they have performed much better than what was expected. And I can go to, probably the extreme end of saying that the tech sector has probably kept the Indian economy, relatively, better placed of the performances. So both in terms of the growth as well as in terms of the jobs. Sure. But we will see how this pans out with the US, because there are a number of things that we will need to, re-engage with the new administration. Absolutely. I'll just leave it on one point, which is, there are going to be issues in terms of, you talked about immigration, we talk about it as high-skilled worker mobility, and then there is technology, and the third is data. So, yeah. So there are a lot of areas to work together.
Sure. I'll come back to you on that, Shivendra. And moving on to Shankar, I know you've been there in North America for quite some time now, last couple of months. So, although we don't want to have a political discussion, when we talk of geoeconomics, we cannot neglect the geopolitics first and the geoeconomics. So my question to you, perhaps is simpler, just for our own understanding and clarification. Is there a difference between geopolitics and geoeconomics, or increasingly they are sort of merging together?
Well, shorn of all the ornamentation, there is no politics without economics, and there can be no economics without politics. I mean, basically, you're balancing of interests. So if you look at the US elections, for instance, whatever we might say of Donald Trump, he did get 70 million votes, and those 70 million votes represent a sentiment of inward-looking economics. And Joe Biden won 74, 75 million votes. They represent outward-looking. We hope so. But at the end of the day, whoever comes to power has to balance the views. They can't rule a divided nation, so they need to sort of put that in we need to put that in perspective and work on that. All economic decisions have to be accepted by the population where they're implemented, and so therefore the primacy of politics over economics has been long established and proved. Even Ruchir's book talks about leadership. There is another book, Why Nations Fail, by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, which looks at the same subject differently. My first book, Accidental India, looked at India's rise outside the spotlight, so to speak, and every change in transformation in India came in the wake of a crisis. So the crisis in any context helps politicians overcome resistance to certain economic policies. For instance, in India, the agri reforms that we have seen in the agriculture sector, I mean, it is quite an irony that India's largest private sector got liberalized 30 years after the industrial sector got liberalized. So it happened, and the Modi administration has used the crisis well, I must say, to push those laws through. So,
Sure.
to sum up, I mean, all geoeconomics is about geopolitics.
Okay. The reason I asked you that question is, if you look back, a couple of years ago when, leaders like, any president or prime minister used to visit some other country, it was essentially a political delegation. Now you hardly see any other politician, but it's basically a business delegation, sometimes in the hundreds. So that's is business so important in politics today, or?
So
and again, when a political kind of transformation happens or a political kind of disruption happens, how does it affect business in your view? Like we are currently in, from an Indo-US business perspective, things are still unclear there. I don't know what's going to happen in Michigan, for example, and will that lead to something else, so on and so forth.
From all my conversations with people in both sides of the aisle, as they say in the US, I think the Biden administration is a given. I mean, coming, how powerful he is or how less endowed he is will be determined by the two runoffs in Georgia. Now, whether he controls the Senate or not. My own sense is that if he doesn't control the Senate, it will be better for him and for the rest of the world, because the inward-looking left socialists in the US who are part of the Biden brigade will not be able to force certain issues. So when we look at these delegations, but actually investment is also politics in another name, because you're investing the savings of your people in another country. And so it is, all of it comes together. However, the flip side, I mean, is that not all political engagements lead to economic advancement. Not all political delegations. So India currently is in a situation where it has advanced security agreements with a large number of countries in the G7, with basically the Western world, which is like the Quad and the 2+2 with the US. But it is yet to sort of be part of any major trade bloc, which is the measure of how integrated you are, or the platform to get integrated into global economies.
Understood.
So, I mean, I'm sure you have other questions as to what will gain or lose in the Biden story, but I'll leave you.
Sure. We'll come to that. Yeah. So, Shivendra, I mean, if you look at, relation between two countries in general.
Sorry, Advair, you seem to have frozen, I think. Your screen, I mean.
Stones that you can think of that work.
Advair, you'll need to repeat that because your screen was frozen. So could you?
Oh, I see. So if you look at relations between two countries in general and Indo-US, of course, in particular, and if you look at last 10-15 years, are there any 2 or 3 big milestones that we can recount or think of which affected these relations both on a positive side as well as on a negative side? And were there any political undertone? And is there, again, because we are still on that politics versus business part of it. So how would you look at from a historical perspective?
See, I think the politics and the economics, as Shankar mentioned, absolutely go hand in hand. So let's look at the tech sector, which is what I represent.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the tech sector, you're seeing that the growth is happening in digital transformation, whether it's AI-led growth, and AI, as you know, is dependent on a very successful data utilization strategy. Now, for a data strategy, we are seeing a lot of fight happening around the world on who controls the data. So, we used to talk about, data is the new oil, but data is the oil. The utilization is the critical part. Now, everyone's realized that. So, on one hand, you're seeing, from a US perspective, you have US and China and the decoupling of the economy happening. Whether it's, the American decision to not allow semiconductor chips to go to the Chinese manufacturers. On the other side, you're seeing the EU looking at, the big tech and how do they regulate the big tech. And, there is talk about this whole digital services tax, and US is out of the OECD discussions on that. Then you have India, which has a lot of data. We are going through our personal data protection bill, and we are looking at an interoperability, in different regimes so that businesses can go. And we are not left as, someone who, is a supplier of raw data. Japan is the other economy. So the question now begs is that, I was, coincidentally reading that you're now calling it technopolitics, global technopolitics. And instead of the, general agreements of tariff and trade, which was the precursor to the WTO, you probably will have a general agreement on data and digital infrastructure, because nations are going to be replaced by platforms, and that is how things are going to move. Now, in the entire geopolitical environment, you will look at democracies probably, combining in terms of, similar thinking and having global alliances around some of this. So while regional trade blocks are important and some of these areas are important, I would, go one step further and say that, from our perspective, we've done a piece of research where we said nearly $500 billion can come up to, additional $500 billion can be generated if we have a successful and a robust AI strategy. And I think we are working very hard on positioning India as that by 2025. So there is a lot of geopolitics and economics merging together. Every politician is looking at creating more jobs in the country, and everyone is saying FDI. So you're looking at, maybe looking at taxing offshore revenue, disincentivizing it, or incentivizing production at local country. And everyone is doing the same. And for everyone, FDI seems to become more important rather than exports. So, are things which we'll have to kind of, look at, while we move forward in this whole relationship, which can't just be Indo-US, it has wider ramifications.
Sure. But my question was, were there any disruptive decisions that were taken that affected the relations or positively as well as negatively?
Well, you can go on to talk about a number of them. You talked about the new civil nuclear agreement, for example. You can talk about, for example, the Quad or some of these which have their own merits in terms of a geopolitical strategic relationship. I will say that from a tech perspective, we've looked at it from a perspective of ease of doing business. And we've seen that we've had challenges over a number of years on movement of high-skilled workers because there is a STEM skills gap. And that STEM skills gap, even in today, for example, where you have high degree of unemployment, you still have more than 500,000 job vacancies in the computer occupation.
Sure.
Clearly endorses the fact that the existing workforce is not being able to bridge that gap. We need to work on making that STEM skills gap available both locally as well as otherwise. So I would love to see that happening as we move forward.
Okay, great. Shankar, again going back to from where you are, and like you said, you've been in discussion with people on both sides of the aisle. Now, even before the elections, there was a lot of discussion in terms of who could be the president, second term or a new term for Joe Biden. And, there were different views in India that, maybe given the relationships that have warmed up between India and US in the last 4 years in this regime, maybe it is better for India from a business perspective as well as political perspective that the current president gets a second term. And there are others who said, change is required and that kind of thing. So what's your take on it from an impact on Indo-US business? So will it be better, like you said, looks like it's Joe Biden. So will it be better, worse, neutral? How does it pan out for India in general and Indo-US business relations in particular?
I think if you put a heat map of Republican and Democratic administrations on India, I mean, the general consensus would be that India has taken hits whenever there's been a Democratic administration.
Yeah.
But if you sort of flip the weightage and then you'll see that the greatest damage would have been done by the Jugalbandi of Kissinger and Nixon, who went to China with the help of Pakistan. I mean, that has changed geopolitics in that entire region for India and for the rest of the world.
Sure.
I mean, today Americans are screaming and shouting about China, but this is they who, I mean, the history of the US-China relationship has defined virtually the history of economics in the last 20, 30 years. It was the Clinton administration which introduced China to WTO. So, and it was the Obama administration which which preferred to sort of stay neutral on issues like Uyghurs, tech, IPRs, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
What Trump has done is actually forced countries to take side. And it's not altruism. I mean, Trump was trying to, Trump's politics has been always to be on his own side and no other side. So that's the kind of politics that you sort of, and if he has lost the election or is losing the presidency, it is because he has failed to recognize that language has implications, consequences. I mean, there's not much any other president could have done given US's system of governance in terms of handling the pandemic, but you didn't need to tell people to inject themselves with bleach or, rubbish scientists and all. So language has consequences.
Yeah.
But who would be better? I don't think we should get into that, which brother do you like most, or whether the mother likes which son the best or the daughter best, which child the best. What India needs to look at is what are its needs and competencies and where it is competitive. So obviously, as Shivendra mentioned, we have certain competitiveness in skilled labor. So we must secure mobility of skilled personnel across the world, not just in the US. But obviously, how you negotiate this with the US, my own sense is that if we do a quick deal with the UK, which is sort of desperate for a deal, we might sort of pave the. But how you do it with the US will determine mobility across the world. Now, whether we like it or not, the world is going to be split into two sides, whether it's tech or trade or investment. Mm-hmm. So one, India needs to sort of look at this as to how we can secure the deal. We have to get that competency. The second is India needs investment. So what is the world looking for? The world is looking for better returns on their investment. Whichever country you look at, there's pension funds and sovereign funds.
Yeah.
So our aim would be to get those investments in and find markets for the goods that would be produced or Absolutely. The services that would be.
Sure.
So we have to be agnostic about who is on the chair and work with whatever is there. I mean, two of India's best relationships have no diaspora, no drama, no optics. And those two relationships are with Japan and Germany. They have been with India on every milestone of trouble or triumph,
And not many people would realize this actually.
No, and we keep constantly talking about this diaspora advantage and stuff like that. The Indians who are there, who are in other countries, have their own interests to look after. They're not going to, beyond the sentiment. And so, I've seen this in 1991, the NRIs were the first to pull out their dollars out of India. And with justifiable reasons, they're not going to sort of risk their own life or savings.
Yeah.
So India's India's strategy has to be anchored on a kind of arranged marriage between platforms. And I completely agree with Shivendra that the world is divided into platforms now. So how we deal with which platform we are on, how the choices we have to make, and we will have to yield. This is something that we have to recognize. The good news is that even on tech, because of the remote working possibilities and other things, we have to. But the one flag that Shivendra mentioned, but I mean, the one flag that I want to plant here in terms of the tech thing is that India desperately needs to get the Data Protection Act out so that it can localize data, so that it can leverage that data.
Sure.
We have to get the sequence right. We missed the hardware bus in 1960s. We almost missed the software bus. Let's not miss the data bus.
Data bus. Okay. Like you said, data is the oil, but data, how to utilize data, as Shivendra said, is the better kind of thing. Shivendra, we talked about, you talked of, both of you have talked about tech and competencies of India in that, and the strength of India. But a simple decision that happened a couple of months ago, and so-called it's valid till 31st December, about this visa ban and things like that. In a normal world, in a pre-COVID world, it would have seriously affected, the growth of the industry and the Indo-US business relationships and the future of that relationship. Now, of course, in a post-COVID thing, I think, like you famously said in one of the interviews I saw, is the new word that you've coined is the COVID shoring of business. So, given this, do these decisions really matter in terms of the business, or it is, business goes on, politics can keep on happening?
No, thanks. I think Shankar did mention that. I think all companies alike, you are going to see a blended model which is going to stay. Whether we hopefully will be able to get across the COVID pandemic sooner than later. But the blended work model where work from home is going to be a part of our lives, which will not change. So it will depend on the percentage of that, and how that will pan out. But having said that, I think, you talked about the executive orders of the president, and there were a number of them. And this particular one, there is a preliminary injunction on that. There's a suit which was filed on that, and there has been a preliminary injunction stopping that. Having said that, how many people would have gone, new people would have gone there, is something which would not be too many. But, the question which begs us is whether it's going to be a work from home model or whether it's going to be on-site model or nearshore model. I think there are a few things which need to be kept in mind. Number one, the companies will go where they will find talent. Every company is now following a model which is, dependent on availability of talent at a particular location. So that's point one. Number two is, because there is a technology overlap on this, you will have, companies going where there is technology. We've done a session with Canada last, few weeks back, and we've done, with the US 4 states with the governors. I think everywhere it's coming out very, very clearly that, there will be an element where startups will have a role to play. There will be academia, and there will be companies, and all of them will be working together with the enterprises or the end users. So that's how things will move on in the long-term period, or mid to the long-term period, with the blended model. Now, with a blended model, it can be working in Cincinnati or it can be working in Bangalore. Same thing, it doesn't make a difference. But the blended model is here to stay. But would I think that, skilled worker mobility will not be an important thing? It will be important. And Indian nationals, I must highlight, have tremendous skills. So if you look at the H1B numbers, over 70% of the H1B go to Indian nationals, not because of anything else, but because of the fact that they are talented, and they are the ones who everyone looks for. And looking at Indian companies, their numbers of H1B usage has declined tremendously, so much so that 2019 figures is about nearly 5,000, 5,500 out of 80,000, which is about 6.5%. So, so the working models keep on changing and evolving, but will skills be important? Absolutely, yes. Now,
so you're saying 5,500, 6,000 compared to maybe 60, 65,000 earlier? Is that the big change?
I would think about, about 25, 30,000 about 2014. So it's come down by more than 60%. So the question is, it's a very, very rapidly evolving business model, but you will see talent going to be the key driver, which will drive companies to be where they will be based.
So let me ask you a question. So one is of course the tech part of it, but there is a good number of manufacturing industries. So if I'm a SMB in India, 100, 200, 300, 400 crore kind of top line. And anywhere between 20, 30% to maybe 70, 80% of my revenue comes from export to US. Now, as this kind of company, I'm talking of manufacturing company, could be tech company also. As this kind of company, does this politics and all really matter to me, or is it, I need to focus on my business? Or in the given circumstances, should I also de-risk and say, I should not put all eggs in the US basket and look at something else? What would be your...
It's not a one size fits all answer to that. You will always have a, de-risk strategy for a country and for a company. So while US is about 62% of our export market and UK is about 17-18%, obviously working hard to try and see how we can expand into other markets. Shankar mentioned Japan, for example. Now, Japan is a minuscule market compared to the size of the market for the tech industry. So we are working hard on that side as well as Germany. You will see a lot of German global captive centers been based out of India. There is robust, approaches that are required. I think advanced manufacturing, every company now or every industry is now a tech industry. I was just sitting in a session yesterday with the Indiana governor, and he used the term all plus tech. So which meant that if it's manufacturing, advanced manufacturing is tech, healthcare is tech, retail is tech, BFSI is tech. So every, automotive is tech. So everyone has a tech element to it. So the question is, there are elements of talent, which is very, very critical in terms of where you will set up and expand. Obviously, the policies of that country and, near the client, I think that's going to be other big one. So if US will be your largest market, you're not going to set up in, any other country and try and deliver from there. Or, that's the kind of thing which will be constantly happening.
Sure. Shankar, although I mentioned about, gave this example of a small company and, should it focus on doing business rather than worry about politics. Let's look at the other side from the politics perspective affecting business. In today's times, does it really matter whether it's India or, whether it's a BJP government or NDA government or a UPA government, or there it's Democrats versus Republican? Are there going to be can any government afford to have major policy shifts that significantly affect their trade relationships with any country? Or there is always now a common ground and, they're just fine tuning depending on some ideology or some politics kind of thing? And therefore, as businessmen, should we be really worried about this political turmoil?
Well, one can't predict black swan events, and one has to be careful. But there are enough amber lights, red lights flashing before an event happens. And what's happened, say, between US and China, and if you are involved in that triangle of doing business with China or the US, sourcing material from China and exporting them to US, you would have got you would have to track what is happening between the two large economies. So what the US thinks and does matter to the rest of the world, because it is 1/3 of the world's consumption is based in the US. So if you looked at all the Senate committee reports, all the congressional concerns about China, you would know that this was a build-up to an event. And first it was there in the language, then first it was there in the technicals, then in the language, then in the politics, and now we see it upfront. And now I think that even if there is a reset, as people are urging, the Biden administration to reset the relationship with China, that might happen at a global level on climate and other things, but the Biden administration will not be able to run away from the charges that have been leveled on China and the issues that have been raked up. For instance, you mentioned the semiconductor industry issues. All those issues are there. So for India to sort of take, or any company to take a given situation as permanent, is a highly risky proposition. So one has to track. But the answer really is to engage with your corresponding side and not and have the corresponding side inform you and your decisions. So if you're working in partnership with a company or providing services or goods to a company, say in Alabama or Pittsburgh or wherever, you would think about what's happening. Similar, the same thing holds if you're in Shenzhen or in the new Xianjing area. So if you were in, say, sourcing material from Xianjing as Apple and others were, you would know that the Uyghur issue will prop up, the forced labor camps will prop up, and so how would you de-risk that?
Sure.
So I don't think you can escape the politics, but there are always ways to sort of de-risking, and which is why it is important to be part of platforms such as the chambers or be part of conversations where you're informed.
Yeah, sure. But for example, can anybody afford to look at or think about Indo-US relations without thinking of, say, China or any other country, given what's happening?
So you're from Pune, and I'm an honorary citizen of Pune. So in different communities they have different networking groups, like the Shannaukuli in among Marathas.
Yeah.
So when you are in the League of Nations, you would know what the big guy and the small guy are doing. So if you are in business, similarly in the US, you have to think about what's happening between US and China, because your client or your sourcing partner might be affected by a decision between those two nations. So this is a given. I mean,
yeah.
So it's like maintaining relationships among families. So, you may not necessarily like the in-laws of X, Y, or Z, but, you have to know what is happening in their lives so that there is no blowback to your relationship. So, I mean, materially also it matters. I mean, for instance, there are companies in Pune like Kalyani Forge, Bharat Forge, Mahindras, others who are now setting up units in the US, and those units also use components sourced from different places. So the South Korea-North Korea relationship matters to the tech world, because if South Korea is hit, or God forbid any event happens, supply chains are disrupted. I mean, what happened in China during Wuhan has material lessons for the rest of the world. And which is why the China Plus One story becomes an interesting opportunity for India. And this window will not be open for long. You have to sort of, so it's like the screen timer. The screen timer is open just now, and India has got to make whatever is possible, or the screen just shuts down.
Sure. Shivendra, have you seen any on-the-ground tangible impact on this China Plus One kind of thing in the tech or non-tech industry?
Well, it is. You talked about the production-linked incentive PLI schemes. Apple, for example, has looked at setting up its supply chain in India. But this is a global thing. TSMC, for example, set up in Arizona, for example. So this is going to continue to happen, because global supply chains have to be there. Dependent on one supply chain, and you talked about this Black Swan event. Absolutely, I think this has taught us a lot.
Sure.
And this is something which will define a lot of business strategies also going forward. And I do agree that it's an opportunity. And I think some of the schemes which the government has put in, for example, on the telecom side, we've recently had this third-party OSP scheme where the regulations have been pretty well, ended on that. So that has been applauded by all and sundry in terms of, the regulation which the government, has put forward. So I think there is a distinct effort to be able to, look at how to make India more competitive and attract investments into India. Our Prime Minister has been speaking to all the major economies on the FDI front as well, and highlighting it even while the pandemic goes on. That's a testimony to the fact that the government lays a huge emphasis on that.
Sure.
We are working with the government on two parts, because I think there's one very, very important part which we haven't talked about too much, is while on the demand side, you will see AI and digital transformation transforming each aspect of our lives, but it is very much dependent on the supply side of talent. And, and if there is a talent bottleneck, this will, absolutely create a huge challenge. And, all research points out to more than 60 to 70% of the existing workforce need to be reskilled. So we are, we've just launched what we call Future Skills Prime with the government of India, and the Prime Minister himself has been very, very keen to push that, where we are looking at 8 or 10 areas in digital transformation, cutting across AI, robotics, machine learning, 3D printing, blockchain, etc., etc. And we're looking at early learning to deep learning at a B2C level. That is going to really, really help in reskilling efforts and making India the supply, talent supply capital, so that we are all aiming to see how we can be the AI and, and the data services hub for the globe. And I think that is what we are aiming to achieve. And with the talent that we have, if nurtured in the right way, we could definitely prove to be the front runners in that.
Sure. But in such situations, you mentioned about talent and the government taking initiatives for skill development. What roles organizations like NASSCOM, for that matter, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, have to play to sort of get this right at the implementation level?
So I'm so proud that we've played this level. It's already implemented. So something, this future skills is not a new thing. 2 years back, the Prime Minister inaugurated it. It was, it was all defined, platform created, all, working perfectly. But that was at a B2B level, which meant it was at a company level.
Yeah.
The government of India wanted it to be done at a B2C level. Just 2 days back, we've done the big launch at a B2C level, which is called Skills Prime. And this is going to be a game changer. So we've already, put in our best foot forward as NASSCOM to look at, new technologies, and all algorithms are there. So it continues to evolve based on how, the technology needs continue to evolve. So it's not static, which a university education or a college education is. So it will continue to evolve as technology evolves. And we are looking at upscaling nearly, 3 to 4 million people. It's a pretty hefty target. So we are already doing our part in this. We are also doing a part on the personal data protection bill, which is absolutely key. We were part of the Sri Krishna Committee recommendations, which made recommendations for the bill. We were also part of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, Q&A, and highlighted our points. We released a report with the US on how do we look at, ease of data flows recently with the US think tank as well. So we are doing a fair bit. We're doing also on AI, the national AI policy, because ethics and data, all of them have to go hand in hand, and it's very critical. So as an association, and all these things which will require a very important governance structure to be created in order for all these policy to, to thrive, we are working, very, very intensively with.
So how much time you would like to give for on the ground impact to be seen at the B2C level?
Well, we've just started, 2 days back, and we have very, very clear-cut targets. So I think you will see that impact, in the next 6 to 8 months. You will already see some.
Wow. Okay, that's quick.
And we will continue to report back. So it is not something which will be kept in.
And you mentioned about 4 million. So it's more or less same.
It's the workforce population. It's the workforce population.
Workforce population in IT. Yeah, I think that's about 4.5 million or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Wow. Okay, so you're actually doubling the number of people who will be skilled.
I wouldn't say doubling. I would say the existing workforce also needs to be reskilled.
Okay.
About 70%, because there are job displacements which are happening. And that question. So if there is going to be automation and machine learning, but it's not losing jobs. It's the nature of the jobs is changing.
it's reskilling rather than just.
Yeah, so that is very, very critical, and you know, and if we have a early mover advantage, and you know, I've been speaking to you know, the United Kingdom, for example, in terms of the government, as well as the US in terms of some of the states, and we are looking at seeing how we can you know, work together, because at the end of the day, you know, we are not saying that you need to transfer workforce from here to different countries. The whole world needs to be upskilled, you know, and if we can work together with different countries, like-minded countries, it can benefit the world only, and you know, make everyone more competitive.
Sure, sure. Shankar, we've been talking of you know, trade, and you know, trade and trade balance is one aspect, and historically India has had a surplus vis-a-vis the US kind of thing. Now, in a relationship, do surpluses and deficits matter, or do the composition of trade matters? Or like Shivendra earlier mentioned, it's the FDI, and you also have alluded to it. The FDI is what matters, or who sort of wears the pants in a relationship when you're talking of surplus or when you're talking of FDI? What is more critical to decide who's wearing pants?
I think the employment map is what matters.
Oh, okay.
At the end of the day, for politicians who ultimately take the decisions, and the reason why governors in the US or provincial premiers in Canada or the prefectures in Japan are talking to people in technology is because they realize that this is going, retrenchment of human interface is the big theme, and this will last for about 10, 20 years. So we know that banking as we know changed. I don't know, I mean, you know, my own guess is that probably ATMs will be the next thing out of the window because of the way we transact. And if I go further, I might say that banks as intermediaries between lenders and borrowers, which is itself under threat. So there are things that are happening. And the point that one must recognize is that technology will also unseat or uproot technology or technologists. So there will be automation, for instance, in the technology sector.
Okay.
What is critical to remember is that we should not try and solve yesterday's problems or today's problems with yesterday's solutions. We have to sort of look ahead and as to where the future map is. And I think, so in the trade balance and investment story, it is always a constant play. So whenever the country which has a deficit points out to the deficit to the nation which is surplus, the surplus nation will always say, for instance, I mean, you know, we are providing critical skills which create so many jobs in the US and which sort of helps the US economy grow. That's our argument. And they will say that, you know, you're not buying enough Harley Davidson motorcycles from us. So no, those are the kind of discussions that would happen. So if you see Indo-US, even Indo-Canada, the same story.
Yeah.
And when we talk to China, we have the same story. So I think what is critical is where the employment map is sort of heading, and that is going to be very important.
Sure,
and
sure. But just to take that point forward of employment map, and I'll go back to what Shivendra had earlier mentioned about 25,000-30,000 visas to about maybe 5,000 or 6,000 recently. It's not that the demand has come down. Maybe the local employment opportunities have gone up, and that's where the gap is. So when we talk of employment gap, it's from whose perspective? From an Indo-US perspective, should we be worried about, you know, whether we are creating employment here, or and obviously they will worry about same thing from their side. So
I think
how do you?
Yeah, it both matter. I mean, you know, for India, it's a concern that, you know, we put up nearly 1 million people join the workforce. I think the number is a little lower now if we look at the demographic map. But we can't be too picky or choosy about where our people get employment. So we have to find employment. And there are various ways. Philippines has what is called an active migration policy, which they send about they target about 1 million people to go there. US and Canada, for instance, have an active immigration policy, which to invite skilled people to come into their country. So we have to match our competencies, our competitive strength with what is needed in the world. So the thing that will matter is that if we are able to persuade, inform, communicate our story. Finally, when you log on to Netflix, you watch convinced by that brief under that movie or the documentary that you want. So, we have to have this constant communication. And I'm very glad that India actually is now having a lot of conversations with provincial people, because the world doesn't run by a centralized leader, and he doesn't have the bandwidth, she doesn't have the bandwidth to do that. So for instance, I think we have to, one thing that I think we have to reskill our economic policy is that nothing is going to be permanent. There are no permanent competencies and there are no permanent competitiveness. We have to work on that. And, even at the very B2C level, we have to tell people that you might be good for the next 2 years. You may. And so this is the roadmap that we have to work with, and at the end of the day, if you have enough people who are getting jobs and the consumption is enough, the market will grow, then the FDI play comes into force.
Sure. I was just looking at some of the questions and the comments that have come up, and it's interesting that you mentioned about provincial. But on a different note, somebody has mentioned that, okay, we've been focusing on president and Trump or Biden, but, look at also what is going to likely to happen at the Senate and its impact in terms of, whoever is the president, or if Biden is going to be the president, and, is he going to be a free flowing kind of thing, or is he going to have a restricted kind of thing in terms of what he wants to do? There's some other question on China, which I think we've discussed. Somebody's asked in terms of, what is the purpose of H-1B visas from a US perspective? Shivendra, you want to answer that? I'm not sure what the question is, but it's just verbatim.
No, a couple of things, I think, slightly wider perspective. There are going to be trade-offs, absolutely. So, Shankar said that, while a country may use, deficit justify and, strengthen and flex its muscles, the fact is everything is not reflected by trade figures. We know that. So, for example, if I'm looking at the tech sector, we did a piece of research with IHS Market, which was published last year. $57 billion is the GDP contribution that the industry makes to the US, which is more than the GDP of 6 states in the US. Now, that kind of a number, even for a services sector, and then we looked at job creation. It's about nearly 500,000 direct and indirect jobs, which have been, generated and supported in the US. So any politician, will look at job numbers as the number one, contributor to, how they think they are performing, because that's how they judge themselves. That, okay, in this year, the state contributed these many jobs. So I think absolutely, that is going to be the name of the game, and the trade-offs will continue from all sides. Coming to the response on the H-1B visas, the H-1B is a non-immigrant visa given for a maximum period of 3 years, for specialized roles. Now, typically, the tech sector has been the main beneficiary of that, and Indian nationals have been the main beneficiary of that. And you'll be surprised to note that, I've spoken to some people who are really connected with the dispensation in the past, and they are not able to differentiate between Indian nationals and Indian companies. They use it interchangeably, which is not correct. Mm-hmm. The fact is the numbers will keep on going up and down as far as Indian companies are concerned, but they will be relevant as long as there is this STEM skills gap, which is going to be there. And they perform a very critical role because, the way it works is there are various teams which are made, so if you have a team of 5 members, there are 2 people who have this skill set who come in from outside and 3 are locally employed. So if you remove the 2, then this whole team gets destabilized. So the local employment will also suffer in a big way. So, and at the end of the day, this is not an immigrant visa. Let's try and understand it. That's why we, and along with our government, also talks about high-skilled worker mobility. And these are precious resources who kind of move from one country to the other. And it's very project dependent. And putting a challenge on that, as you've seen from a number of executive orders, has hampered the industry, both US and Indian industry in the past. And you're seeing number of lawsuits which are there, which have been fought at the current juncture. And we need to work on that. So that's the response on the H1B.
So you're saying that actually this ban, or if there's any adverse decision related to release of visas and quotas for Indians, it will actually adversely affect US economy as well?
Absolutely. In the sense that, see, let's say the tech sector. The tech sector works with 75% of the Fortune 500 companies. Majority of them being American companies, enables them to grow, create more jobs, and make America the #1 economy in the world. Now, we are talking not only about Indian tech sector, but the US sector, which gets these visas. So if you prevent that in some way or form, you leave a gap of people not being able to do the job. Now, what will happen is either the job will not be done or it will be all offshore.
Yeah.
So that is how things will pan out.
Sure, great. There's one more question which is specific on Reliance Jio, but I'm not sure this is the right forum to talk of a specific company, about various American investments into Jio and its impact, but maybe so we can take that offline. We're running out of time, so one last question to both of you. Starting with Shivendra again, what's the future in your own view in terms of Indo-US business relationships? And what is the best case scenario from your perspective? And what could be the worst case scenario?
Well, I won't be a soothsayer to highlight a best case or a worst case scenario. I think India-US relationships is based on very strong fundamental partnership, whether it's geopolitical, strategic, security, and economic as well. We mentioned that US is the largest partner for us.
Sure.
This is the largest market by leaps and bounds. And there is a lot of complementarity and synergies which the US and the Indian tech sector, at least the one which I represent, enjoys, and you will see that growing. I think companies find a way out in terms of challenges. When they see a challenge, they do work on finding a way out to those challenges, and that's more to the resilience of those companies, and we must grant it to them. But I think from a NASSCOM perspective, we would definitely want ease of doing business, interoperability of a data adequacy regime, and being able to work at a bilateral level to help promote US investments in India and making the ease of doing business good, as well as looking at Indian companies in the US market and growing. I see the US going to be not as a part of our main policy going forward. It will continue to be the main country which we will be engaged.
Sure, great. Shankar, your take, best case or worst case scenario, or best thing to happen or the worst thing that potentially can happen?
Well, let me put it this way. The Indo-US relationship has sort of yo-yoed between convenience and conviction. So in the 60s, they messed up, went to bed with dictators, Mao, and spoke about democracy on other platforms. Slowly, the theory has now come around, and there is conversation about tying up with democracies, which is why the China +1 story is sort of popping up now.
Yeah.
And if they are realistic about the two different ways to go about it, I mean, the question before the US is really whether they want to engage with the world's largest democracy. Can they afford not to be in partnership with the world's largest democracy? Can they afford not to be in business with the largest pool of skilled talent in the world? So those are the questions that the Americans need to answer, and these are the questions that will pop up time and again. For India, this is India's time in the world when the world is looking for a new paradigm, which is based on technology, which is based on plurality, on democratic traditions. So do we measure up? And how do we measure up? By designing our policies to meet with the needs of the world. So you have to design whatever you put out there to match the aspirations of the world. So there's a lot of work needed to be done. As I said, that India must also redesign its policies from the convenience paradigm to a conviction paradigm. And I think if we do that, we might just get in while the window is still open.
Sure. But this convenience to conviction has to work both ways.
Of course.
Yeah.
Very much
Okay.
so.
Sure.
And
sure.
we have to present the case that to the US that you have based your relationship. I mean, so there are many parts to it. The US will have to redefine its relationship with China, with Pakistan, and other places. And India will have to relook at some of its own relationships. So if you want to be successful, you have to be on the biggest platform.
Yeah. I cannot let you go without asking you a question about media, because you've played a big role there and you represent media. There's been a great interest or too much interest or extra interest about US elections and what's going to happen in the Indian media. And we are jumping about India, Indo-US. Sitting there, do you see as that much excitement about US-Indo, rather, or are we just jumping up and down and it's just a one-way kind of cacophony?
Well, we are an aspirational country, an aspirational economy. So there is a certain amount of excitement that is bound to be there when you see an Indian name on the ballot. I think, having said that, it is also India, the US has always figured high up on Indian aspirations, whether now or in the 70s or the 80s. I mean, it's not for no reason that Indians are running several US corporations. I mean, so there is a two-way story, people-to-people story there. Sure. But I don't know whether necessarily I represent the media or whether the media represents people's or the audience expectations. These are too open a question. I do accept that I have been a journalist and will always be a journalist for the rest of my life. You don't retire from certain professions. But a lot of what is happening is also governed by what is put out on the social media. So, I mean, now the media is largely you and others who are on Twitter and Facebook and different Instagram or other platforms. So, I mean, so there is an excitement, and I think that the excitement is justifiable.
It's not necessarily unjustified.
Well, it's the engagement in this part of the world is about the coming together of countries that respect rule of law, the order, and stuff like that, and how they are able to build their economies around that. So India always has been part of India is, for good or bad, the largest free market democracy in the world. So, I mean, you have to keep that in mind.
So it's important from their perspective as well.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Shankar. Thanks, Shivendra, for your time and for your valuable inputs. And may I
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Advait.
May I invite Abhijit to
Thank you so much.
Close the session.
Wow. This was a very informative and relevant between the lines session, which is co-hosted today by ISCC and Upon Management Consultants. And now it's my job to conclude today's event. I'm Abhijit Shah. I'm the Vice Chair for the ISCC Pune chapter this year. So I guess we started with Eklavya Malhotra with Upohan, who did an excellent summary for Ruchir Sharma's book, The 10 Rules of Successful Nations. And so just for the people who joined late, no, neither India nor the US are in the top 5 based on these rules. I guess what US needs to follow the 11th rule, I guess, which is if you lose an election, please go ahead and concede. Later on, I think we moved to the panel discussion, Indo-US geoeconomics. Atul Kurlekar of Upohan. Atul, you did a great job of moderating the session and asked all the right questions that all of us wanted to ask and hear about. And we had 2 excellent panelists who I really want to personally thank both of them, starting with Shivendra Singh, who heads the Global Trade and Development Department and NASSCOM. Thanks, Shivendra. Excellent job. and Shankar Iyer, political economy analyst, columnist, author, journalist. Is doing everything. So thank you both for immensely knowledgeable and insightful experience. We all hugely benefited from all your thoughts and experiences today. And since the topic was Indo-American business, I guess it was very relevant for us because we are the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. And also the timing is also pretty relevant given the transition from Kemcho Trump to Aujo Biden, I guess. But as we heard, I think probably it doesn't really matter. It's the two businesses that have to work together. So that was good to hear. Also want to thank Rakhi Sikka for putting together this session. And obviously our fearless leader, Rujuta Jagtap, she's the Executive Director of Saj Test Plant. And more importantly than that, the Chairperson of ISCC Pune chapter this year. And last but not least, a huge thanks to the entire audience today, who comprise both of the members of ISCC as well as non-members to take out time on this Friday evening and attending this event in large numbers. We look forward to an engaging and active participation from all the members in our future events as well. We have a great event actually coming up early next year, the Manufacturing Conclave, which is called Integrate, and it will have both Indian as well as international American speakers. So look forward to that. At ISCC Pune, what we've done this year is we have set up various different groups and committees. They have legal, manufacturing, academia, finance and taxation, and we'll be bringing exciting webinars and events for all the members to benefit. And for those of who are not members yet, I don't know why, so you need to do that, and we're ready to welcome you on board. Please reach out to us with your suggestions and inputs. We're looking forward to that. And with this, I'll formally conclude today's event. I would say stay safe. And if you have not already, please do concede to coronavirus, wear a mask, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.